Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Hype, Conversations on Mobilizing Zero Trust with Forrester's Chase Cunningham and Illumio's PJ Kirner. In this session, we'll be covering an overview of Forrester's Zero Trust framework, how to prepare your organization for Zero Trust, how to design and implement a Zero Trust architecture, and finally, Illumio's role in enabling you to achieve Zero Trust.
So Zero Trust is a framework that's been around for about a decade. People often get wrapped around trying to figure out, well, is Zero Trust just a concept or is it a concrete framework? How do we do this? How do we apply it? Can we implement this? The answer to that is you can. The reality of where we were with Zero Trust is it started out about a decade ago with a focus on sort of data, network, and then applying really granular micro perimeters all the way down to like the data piece. And that's an interesting approach, but it's actually kind of hard to do. So what we've evolved Zero Trust into is what we call now ZTX. And ZTX is the practical implementation framework for Zero Trust. What we've done is we've carved up Zero Trust into 7 pillars. There's people or users, devices, workload, network, and the center of this whole thing is data, because that's what we're ultimately about protecting. And then there's 2 rings of automation, orchestration, and visibility and analytics. Those 7 pillars are what make up a Zero Trust infrastructure. Now, the modularity that's within those pillars is there for a reason. It's very real to understand that your organization may not have all of those 7 things needed to get towards Zero Trust. And if that's the case, that's okay. That's why the framework was built on this modular sort of approach. If you don't have an issue with workloads right now because you're not living in the cloud, okay, worry about workloads later. If you don't allow people to have devices that access your network, which would be hard to do nowadays, but maybe that's not the problem, great, get to that later. Focus on each one of those pillars, be modular about it, and dial in on what you should and shouldn't have to fix, and work your way through that as a program. Now, just to dive in a little bit more on the trending around Zero Trust and ZTX, we've seen a massive explosion in this as far as a strategy for organizations, all the way up to, we've sent papers up to the White House. We've been working with legislators on Capitol Hill. The DoD is deeply engaged in multi-year, in some cases decade-long implementations of Zero Trust. Major banks are dialing in on how to enable Zero Trust. Some of the largest media companies on the planet are actually working with us to figure out how they can enable this concept and strategy. And that's just on the people implementing it for their organizations. If you look at the vendor side of this equation, vendors in cybersecurity have run to try and figure out how they can map to Zero Trust so that they can be part of this whole mindset shift and program that we've got in place. And that's actually very interesting, because that's the first time you've kind of seen that as far as a strategic implementation of a framework in cybersecurity. We saw it a little bit with some of the compliance initiatives where the vendor community was rushing to say that they enable PCI compliance or HIPAA or HITRUST, but we hadn't seen it where every one of them that was in the space was diving in on enabling Zero Trust and speaking about how they can help you get to Zero Trust. So it's broad in scope. It's a big thing to consider. But the reality of what you get if you get in on Zero Trust and understand how to apply it is that you are categorically, fundamentally changing the way that you do security. You are no longer just striving to be more secure. Your organization is not just trying to keep the bad guys out. You put a line in the sand and you say, my organization seeks to enable a Zero Trust infrastructure. And then you look at the framework, you look at the vendors that have been mapped to that framework, and you figure out how you apply them and where to use them. And you can be much more pragmatic, much more programmatic, and much more focused on actually getting on a Zero Trust journey, so that you're not dialing in on just doing security for the sake of doing security. The last thing that I would say is that what stands out to me in this space is anytime you see the vendor community, federal workspace, major banks, healthcare, all these organizations wrapping their head around how they can enable this particular solution, that means that there's some real veracity there. So I think one of the takeaways that you have to have when considering zero trust is you've been doing things with the perimeter-based model for the last 20 or 30 years. That has continued to fail. There are breaches that occur, there are failures that occur, massive exploitation scenarios. If that worked, we wouldn't continue to see those type of failures. The only way that we change the game and the only way that we get any better in this space is to stop trying to be secure and start focusing on grand strategic initiatives and mapping solutions to enable that strategy. That's what zero trust is. That's what zero trust gives you. And ZTX helps you figure out which solutions you use to enable that. So when I talk to people about zero trust, one of the first things I tell them that they need to focus on is visibility, understanding the totality of what they have to defend. If you don't know what you're going to defend, how could you ever possibly defend it? There are twists on that narrative. Some folks, if they don't have a really good identity and access management program, should probably look at doing that first. It's a relatively simple problem to solve. But as you move further into the complexity of the zero trust journey, you have to keep continuing to dial up on that capability set. By the time you're done, or even close to being anywhere finished on a zero trust implementation, you should be able to see everything all the time. And if you're not doing that, if you can't stand up in the boardroom and sort of say, I feel like I got this, like I know what's going on, that means something is missing. So visibility, knowing what's going on in your infrastructure and being able to say, these are the sort of boundaries that I'm responsible for. I don't say perimeter, because the perimeter's obliterated, but the boundaries, the edge of what I'm responsible for, knowing that I understand what's traversing this, east, west, north, south, and what I'm responsible for. I think if you can do that, you've got a good spot to start on zero trust.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we talk about often is this idea of having a map, right? A map is a good way to sort of think about, how to defend, your critical assets. I mean, the other thing I think about, when people start that, when people do zero trust is about like, it's a philosophy, right? Like it could be a goal state, but it's a philosophy that you sort of have to adopt. And I kind of liken it to the least privilege, model. And that's a philosophy that you have to apply across the board, across all kind of controls, whether it be user or network or devices or or people. And then secondly, the other thing is, I mean, there is kind of a change from a whitelist, like a blacklist mentality to a whitelist mentality, and that again is a philosophical change, right? And it aligns with least privilege. A whitelist is kind of a least privilege model. What do you sort of think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's dead on, and that your first point about like this is a journey. Like I remind people all the time in workshops, like this should be uncomfortable. Like when you start on anything and you've engineered a system for 20, 30 years to do something, and you're saying categorically we're going to change the way that we do this, it's gonna hurt, and that's okay. Like you're actually, in the long run, the benefit will outweigh the pain that you feel at the beginning. So, that point that you made about this being necessary to understand that this is a journey and that you start somewhere and you're moving towards an end state. Like I remind people that all the time, like when you start, get ready. You're going to be a bit uncomfortable, but understand the payoff comes as you progress. And that last piece too about the dialing in on sort of the least privilege access and all that. Access is super important here, and being able to make sure that you know who's doing what, where, when, and when they're accessing things and how they're accessing that information, and also knowing what that information looks like as it sits inside of the data center is pretty critical.
Yeah, I think tying it back to visibility. When you're on a journey, visibility and being able to show progress on, increasing that visibility or understanding sort of where you are, visibility is key to actually showing progress to the board.
Yeah, any journey that you take, you should have a map, right? Yep. And that's how you see where you're starting and where you're going to end up. So I think if you don't have that, you're missing a really critical piece of this puzzle. So in zero trust, segmentation is key, is critical. If you've looked at what's going on in the market over the last X number of months, microsegmentation is like rocketed to the top of the sort of word cloud. Segmentation is pivotal. Organizations nowadays spend a lot of time trying to defend everything all the time. It's impossible. You can't do that. And the other piece of that puzzle is compliance. If you do it incorrectly and you're not segmented functionally, it means you're compliant for everything all the time across the entirety of that infrastructure. If you actually look at what's written into those guiding documents and sort of what wraps you around how to do this, it doesn't ever say your entire infrastructure should be focused on compliance. You should be compliant for what is living within that entity so that you know that you can defend it. And if you carve things off correctly and you understand exactly what's operating within that environment, you can actually be compliant and you can actually have things in place to minimize the problem. When you look at where mega breaches go from problematic to end of days type thing, it's when lateral movement occurs. So if you're segmented and you're segmented correctly, it's okay to have an infection. It is not the nuclear fallout that you might have if you don't have segmentation in place. And I work with people on workshops and advisory, and I tell them flat out, I don't really care if there's an infection if I'm segmented correctly. I can live with that. That's an IT problem. That's not even necessarily a security problem if I built those boundaries the right way.
And one thing we're sort of seeing with our customers is people sort of focusing on crown jewels, right? Critical applications. People have lots of different names for these things, but you have to start by identifying them. If you don't know what your crown jewels are, if you don't have an application inventory with some kind of priority on that, you have to start with that, right? Because you can't do segmentation without the understanding. But then that's when you start to focus on those critical applications. How do you sort of segment those off from the less critical applications? It's not just about dev and prod, segmentation. That's kind of an obvious one of different kind of levels of priority. But we've seen people who have had challenges where you come in, you have an infiltration on a low value application in production because obviously you didn't spend as much time and energy. Doing penetration testing or whatever on that application. And then there is the lateral movement phase, right? And they traverse laterally to a high value application and gain assets there. So that kind of lateral movement, both detection and prevention. I mean, if you think about segmentation for one second, it's lateral movement prevention capability. So being able to prevent that movement inside those data centers and clouds between different levels of priority of applications is critical, and that's the place to start.
Well, and also still dialing in on the visibility and analytics side of this, how do you ever segment if you don't know what you should be segmenting and you don't know where those things traverse? And if you're not doing that, you're really not doing anything correctly.
Yeah, I mean, we've found that having that map, right, and being able to sort of understand what normal is, and then sort of being able to detect what abnormal is valuable. Also, another value is being able to sort of model what segmentation is, right, before you go apply it, because applying segmentation straight off the bat can break a lot of things, and that's not a good experience for the business, right? So being able to model something, being able to test something, be able to prove that you operationally can still work while increasing your security is a valuable way of approaching the problem.
Yeah. So zero trust is a journey, and anytime you're on a journey, right, things are going to come up along the way. You've got to be able to adapt and modify and approach those new problems. And people ask me all the time about, well, if we're into this thing, we're locked in, there's no way that we can be as agile as we should be. That's incorrect. If you look at what technology is supposed to do and the way that you're supposed to use it, like virtualization, segmentation, all these other things are built so that you can carve out areas where you can bring in new systems, new tooling, new technology, and actually have it sort of live and breathe and make sure that it's right, and then migrate it into that process. It's the same thing for anything that you're doing along the lines of zero trust. You should be using those systems and tools and technologies to actually get ready for when that new stuff comes. And if you're following the mantra and the strategy side of this and you know where you're going, you can understand how to grab something and bring it in and make it part of that process. If you don't do that, what you wind up doing is exactly what we have now, where everyone is trucking along and then something new comes up and you go, well, I need that, and they bolt it right in, and then you've just bolted in something you weren't prepared for. That doesn't work in sales, it doesn't work in business, it doesn't work in logic. Like, the only way that you can do that is to use the systems and tools the way that they were created functionally and say, I'll let this thing do what it's going to do, make sure it's right, and then I'll bring it into my process as I go forward. Not just bolt it in and cobble it on and keep moving forward.
Now, the other thing that I see is when you sort of buy products, right, it has to be part of the buying criteria to understand how it fits into your zero trust ecosystem. Like, do they have the right automation, right? Do they have the right APIs? Because I think actually automation is key to making these things successful. Being able to have a security engineer automate the process. Because if this is something that's constantly changing, right, whether it's new people coming on board or new machines coming on board or people leaving and so on, there's constant change in that environment. The only way you can sort of keep up with a least privilege access model or the zero trust is to be able to have automation. I've heard a few forward-looking CISOs who sort of say they hire security engineers who want to automate themselves out of that job, right, to find the next job. And I think finding those people, right, having the tools that allow for automation, having those people in your organization actually allow you to be agile enough to accomplish zero trust.
Well, and part of your point about automation, orchestration, and APIs, like when we created our framework, we actually made sure to put those in as pillars of the ZTX framework because we see that as being so pivotal to zero trust. Like,
I agree completely.
I totally, when we do the evaluations and look at corporate companies that are included, like if they can't tell me how they automate and orchestrate and how I could use that API to do those functions, then they're missing a key piece of it.
But that's also a recommendation of the CISO is that they need to have those people on board who can do those things, because that is a kind of cultural. It is a skill, and it's a mindset that you have to be aligned with that.
So early adopters of zero trust started off really heavily in the federal government space, which I think is actually a really good thing. People forget that in the security, we all actually follow what the Fed does. They're the folks that were the ones that originally were known as far as getting hacked and fighting the bad guys. Banks followed after that, and healthcare, and now down into the trenches of everyone else. We've seen zero trust conversations spin up very heavily all the way up to federal legislation. We spent some time on Capitol Hill working to draft some of that. U.S. Navy, DOD, Department of Homeland Security, a bunch of federal agencies. The last count that I had was about 22 so far have either done active engagements on zero trust or have started to ask for sort of thought leadership and guidance around it. We've seen a large uptick as well in the space around healthcare. And following along behind that would actually be the legal industry, which is good because the legal industry's got information and data that nobody wants getting out there. Our own growth of this thing as far as once we've launched the framework and really formalized it, our own people are telling us that their consulting and sales opportunities are up almost 700%. We're seeing a large growth in that area too. And on the inquiry side, for just us as analysts on the security and risk team at Forrester, we're averaging almost, I think we did about 500 inquiries last year on the topic. So, meteoric would be a small way to say the amount of growth we've seen in this space.
And where we've sort of seen adoption is in the highly regulated, areas. So, for example, financial services, as you sort of talked about, there's a bunch of people with critical customer assets. You sort of got legal, SaaS companies who sort of run, multi-tenant applications that have critical business, business critical data for our customers. Anybody who has those kind of crown jewels, we've sort of seen adoption of segmentation. But what do you think we can learn from those, early adopters? What are because those are the people at the forefront, so they're learning things and stumbling and succeeding, and what can we learn?
Well, most of them have learned kind of the hard way where you should and shouldn't focus to begin with. And usually the single most important piece that comes up in our conversations is actually taking a breath and stepping back from the constant onslaught of buying technology and then fighting the fight as you continue to chug forward. Really, it's those leaders that have stood up and said, okay, we've been trying it this way for 20, 30 years and we got it wrong. Not for lack of effort, but just for, that's just not the way things were gonna play out. So those folks that have stood up and said, look, we got to plan, we got to strategize, we got to do more dialed in technology selection and actually know what we're trying to fix first and then work their way forward, are the ones that have been doing the best, if you will. There are others that have still said we're going to try and do this at light speed. You know, there's some ground to be gained there, but in reality, it's the ones that have actually aligned strategy and with some of those DoD and federal agencies we've been talking to, they've flat out said that this is like a decade-long thing for them. And I mean, anytime that the federal government says they're diving in on something and they're willing to plot and plan for a decade, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, we've seen people who kind of jump in and want to do this, and like they follow the boil the ocean strategy, which seems to never ever work. But they get excited. I mean, the wanting to boil is a sign of excitement, and that they see the value of that, right? But you know, fundamentally, again, understanding what your crown jewels are, your critical assets, sort of, and picking a application or a set of applications in which to demonstrate and do this successfully is really important. Like having a single, like whether it be an application or environment or something that you have successfully done, showing that all the processes work, all the automation works, and then can demonstrate that to the rest of the organization, as kind of the beacon of, like, here's how to do it. We were successful. We learned these things, and we can do this at scale. Is an important way to sort of gain momentum in a lot of these large enterprises, at least for what we've seen.
Yeah, well, and for the DoD side and for the early adopters of this, one thing that came up where they moved towards ZTX and sort of the ecosystem and framework approach, in security, you're always proving a negative. If you're doing your job right, nothing goes wrong. Mm-hmm. So then how do you go back and say, I need more budget, I need more everything to do this further on, and the people that are paying for it go, well, wait a minute, nothing's wrong. So if they don't have a way of assigning metrics to it and don't have a way to map, we have solved this problem, exactly what you said, and then we're moving to the next piece, then you're always just asking for more. And it's way better to go back to the board and the leadership and say, I have solved this pillar. Now I will move to this pillar, and this is what we will do, and this is how we will do it, and just practice moving along that path.
The other thing we've sort of seen is people want to either work on legacy environments or want to work on greenfield environments. And these are kind of two strategies that you can sort of make. It's like, worry about what you have there that's in your legacy brownfield environments, or just focus on the new applications that are sort of coming out. And ultimately, success, what we've seen is success is people who do both of those things. Sometimes they need to start with one, but when they do both of those things, because the brownfield never disappears as fast as you want, right? And the greenfield, the greenfield never, just takes over everything, right? So having this two-pronged strategy of dealing with legacy and then being able to apply these new strategies to all new things that you do, whether it's new, a new office that you set up or a new application that you set up. That kind of two-pronged strategy has been really successful for our customers. So what we've sort of seen is people either start in a legacy environment, right? And because there's a lot of critical assets and crown jewels in those legacy environments, in AIX servers and Solaris and mainframes and so on. That's one strategy people take. The other strategy people take is they focus on their greenfield environments. They sort of say they draw a line in the sand and say all new things will kind of follow this strategy. It will be segmented. The challenge is both those strategies have challenges. Like the brownfield never disappears, as fast as you want, greenfield doesn't always. You don't always put all your critical applications in greenfield. So what we've seen as a successful, and what we've recommended is a successful strategy of people who do both of those things. A dual prong strategy. Deal with legacy because it's always going to be there, and then sort of allow you to like do greenfield, so all new applications, so you can actually make progress for all new applications, going forward, and that provides a good metric, right? For success in some of in these projects.
Yeah, it seems that there's like what you were saying is there's a combination, right? There's not necessarily a one is better than the other. It really, in my mind, depends on how far down the rabbit hole you already are. If you're already moving everything, rocket speed to the greenfield environment, I personally think you have to focus there and be able to dial in on that, because that's where you're going to wind up living. If you're, going down sort of the slow path towards migration, and you've got a lot of brownfield that you're moving to greenfield, et cetera, I think you can be a little bit more half and half on it and kind of focus there. But regardless, I think to your point, you have to make that stance of, from here on out, this is where new stuff will live and breathe, and this is how we control that, and this is how we do things. And if you don't do that, it doesn't matter, groundfield, brownfield, whatever, you're going to wind up, cross-pollinating. So yeah, I think that there's a careful balance there, but really, it, in my opinion, seems to work out best when you realize where you are and how soon you're going to get to that next step.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. You have to, understand the balance between those two things, and they're both different in terms of how you, approach them. At least from a segmentation point of view, in the brownfield, like you don't even know what you have. Like the people who built these things might no longer be at the company. So there's a certain kind of approach you take when you work there. And then for greenfield, there's a whole bunch of new processes you can put in place in terms of tagging and metadata, and just make requirements, and applications can't go live until they sort of meet those requirements. So there's slightly different strategies, to accomplish both those things. But that's where they're both kind of, in my opinion, they're both kind of necessary, especially in the enterprises, unless you have one of those rare cases where you are actually making, or starting from scratch. Like that's another example, right? Where you just need the one. And the one other challenge I'll just say from my experience is a lot of companies do acquisitions, right? And that's another thing that messes things up. So you might be a company that's all in Amazon or something, and then all of a sudden you acquire a company that maybe has a legacy data center, or they're all in Azure, right? And now you have to sort of figure out how to
multi-cloud
do this thing. So. That's kind of another natural state of a lot of large companies, and small companies too, that they acquire things and they need to solve the problem in this multifaceted way.
In order to get organizations to buy into zero trust, you've got to change the conversation. For the longest time in security, we've had this sort of conversation going on of like, I need security stuff because security is cool and security does what security does, right? We haven't talked to them about how this enables business. And if you have a strategy in anything, right? Like look at sales. If you're going to sell stuff, you have to have a strategy. You have to have a strategy leader. You have to have metrics. You have to be able to align all that stuff. Everyone figures out how they play in that thing, and then they go forward and sell. It's the same thing in security. And so what we have to do is move away from talking to the board and leadership about security and firewalls and tooling and technologies and AV and all this other stuff. And we've got to say like, look, we're doing this because in the next generation, the future, we have to be more secure. If we want to live, if we want our business to continue to grow, if we don't want to wind up on the cover of USA Today or CNBC as the ones that are liable for this mega breach, we have to be secure. And the way that we do that is via aligning with a long-term strategy and figuring out which technology solutions we're going to bring in, and making it where we go from being the sort of angry stepchild in the room constantly griping for more things to like, this is what we're doing and why, and you need to give me what I need so that I can enable that. And if you can do that, the board understands it, CEOs understand it, like the context of how this enables business matters and translates way better than what you get if you just talk about doing more security.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I've sort of seen if you can tell the story about risk and understand and have the business owner, right? Whether if you run a product or run a service, either external service or internal service, if you kind of understand what the risk is, or if the CISO can help the business owner understand what the risk is, and then if the business owner sees minimizing risk as kind of a competitive advantage to their business, like that, if that happens, right, then you can sort of get that alignment between what you need for zero trust and how the business works. We've even seen some customers use adoption of these principles as an external competitive advantage against other competitors. Like, look how secure we are. Look how safe your data is in our environment, and they use that as a value that they sort of provide to their customers, right? So and that takes it sort of full circle out to again. I mean, it is really a lot of these things is the customer's data, right, themselves. So being able to demonstrating and explaining how you are secure with that data is really important.
Well, and if you look at the organizations that are buying in on security, it's everybody everywhere, right? It's healthcare, it's manufacturing, it's whatever, it's automation. You name it, they're getting in on security in some way, shape, or form. And to your point about being a competitive advantage, if I'm a consumer and I'm looking at a company and they have some sort of line on security, I'll probably do more business with them than someone that I know doesn't. And it's just that clear. There's a reason that some of these organizations that have nothing to do with IT or technology have got multi-million-dollar security operations centers. It's not because they want to be cybersecurity companies. It's because they know that the value that good security can bring to land more customers and grow revenue.
And they do also need a way to explain that to customers, right? There's one thing to have good security, and then there's another way to communicate that out. And right, and again, that's sort of business aligned, and that's where adoption of zero trust or some of the other SOC 2 or some of those PCI or some of those other compliance frameworks help you explain to customers. But I think zero trust is another way that you could use to, I'm adopting this, and this is what I'm doing, and these are sort of the metrics I'm using. That's another way to explain to customers about how you're improving your security posture.
Absolutely. So a zero trust program will have some impact to your existing security expense, the things that you've bought. To give you an example, I did a multi-week thing with a major cruise line. And when we looked at and actually inventoried to start, right back to that sort of know what we need to know piece, they had 58 security solutions in their portfolio. They'd had 6 CISOs in 5 years, so every new CISO got to buy new gear and put it in and turn things on and keep growing and going. And their poor guys in the Security Operations Center were looking at alerts because of alerts on top of an alert, right? That literally had security tools alerting on top of other security tools. When we got forward into that program, they went from 58 to 11. So they got rid of 30-something other solutions that they didn't need, that were actually redundant or sucking up budget or causing problems and degrading the network. And what they saw was that, again, back to that thing we talked about earlier, like it was a little bit uncomfortable to look at the totality of things that they had spent money on. But as they moved forward, they got rid of all that other stuff. And if they're doing it correctly, and some of that functional segmentation we were talking about, you're probably going to have things that you have to pick and pull, but it's not necessarily a rip and replace. And as long as you have a plan in place and you can figure out where you're going to be, you can start lining up a timeline and saying, this comes out here, this comes out there, this is the benefit I'm going to get, I just freed up this much budget. It just becomes a constant sort of evolution of optimizing the infrastructure and the network instead of just putting more things in there and actually adding to the workload.
The security control effectiveness is something that's very interesting. I think the other thing that when people go, if they have this zero trust methodology, right, they can sort of look at the tools they have and say, does it support, does it have the right automation, right? Does it have the right integration with, the application development lifecycle or application, operation lifecycle? And if it does, then those are sort of tools they should keep. And sometimes if it doesn't align with that, then maybe they need to go look for some other tool that does have better alignment with a zero trust philosophy. I think there's the effectiveness part, and then I think there's the alignment with where you're you're going, right? I mean, you need both of those things to sort of be successful. But one question I have for you is, there's a lot of hype around, zero trust. Like, can one vendor zero trustify your environment? What is your thoughts on that?
So I think I've said it before in blogs and whatnot. I think the hype is a good thing because that means that people are paying attention and that we're getting conversations started. But yes, there's a lot of marketing stuff bouncing around zero trust, and obviously anytime that there's a hot topic, people try and chime in on that. That's okay, that's just how things work. But categorically, unequivocally, there is no button you push from a vendor to zero trustify an environment. The vendors that actually understand this are much more open and honest about that reality, and they say what they do and where they function to enable zero trust. And they also are willing to say, like, look, there's things that we don't necessarily do that well. However, we can plug and play with these other solutions to enable it long term and get you towards that next state. So, I tell people pretty repeatedly that don't buy, the hype when it says, oh, here's a zero trust, thing that you just turn on and all of a sudden you're zero trusty. Like, no, there are ways to get to zero trust. There are vendors that understand it. There are folks, to your point, that are aligned with it. But they also are willing to say, like, this is what we're really good at, and this is how we allow others to make you even better by plugging into us.
So it is about, APIs are about taking controls, and there's about pushing data to other things. So it is about building an ecosystem, like of vendors that sort of, and then vendors who want to play in that ecosystem and believe they're part of an ecosystem is what you're looking for, I think.
Right, and well, that's why even in our research we call it the ecosystem, because we see that there is no singular sort of vendor that can do all of this, because it's a big problem to solve. But yes, there are those that can integrate and optimize, and those are the solutions that actually have the most benefit when you're looking at a grand strategy like zero trust. So measuring the success of a zero trust program is a question that comes up pretty often. And interestingly enough, it sounds a little bit confusing, but I tell people, like, the measurements that you take on this are more just for milestones along the way. This is a journey. This is not a destination. In reality, you'll never be done. You won't ever just be able to stand up and say, I'm zero trust, like I'm finished. This is you versus people that are actively engaged in cyber criminal operations, nation states, all that other stuff. They'll never stop, so you can never stop. But to make sure that you know how you're getting towards the next step, you should be using something like a framework. If it's the one that we've launched, great, the ZTX side, and look at the pillars and sort of the modularity of that system and assign milestones in that path. I have solved the people bubble, great. And how did I solve it? I took care of multi-factor and SSO and these things. Okay, super. Now I've moved on to workloads. Well, how did I solve workloads? I've got microsegmentation in the cloud. I have 100% east-west traffic. I can see north-south. Super. Now let's move on to the next. And you just keep putting pillars and milestones together and mapping your journey along that way. And guess what? When you get it all done, that's when you start over again. You say, okay, well, I'm back to zero. I need to keep going, because there's going to be new technology, new solutions, better ways to do it, new attacks, all those things. Like, this is a constant evolution. And you're never going to have a check in the box that says we are 100% zero trust. And I personally think that's a good thing. It means that you can't sit on your laurels and think you got it right. Because the moment you do that, you open yourself up to exploitation. And that's what the enemy is waiting for, is for you to be like, I'm solid, I'm set, nothing bad can happen. You have to just keep going.
Yeah, one thing we sort of see with our customers, right, in the segmentation space is people are doing application ring fencing or application segmentation, sort of, use that as a metric, right? So, and you're absolutely right. They're like, you have to work on all these applications. You have to work on the new applications that you're deploying. You have to work on your legacy applications. You have to make that metric and go, week by week, month by month, and you need to make progress on that, because it does take a long time, and as you sort of said, new applications are coming. You have to make sure those are protected, right? Sort of have a philosophy for both those things. The other thing that I've sort of, in my own personal opinion, is like the old way, in my opinion, like the old way of doing things is you have like a perimeter. How a user behaves outside the perimeter when they're like at Starbucks versus how they behave, inside the perimeter is is not a zero trust, like it's a anti-pattern, right? So having people sort of behave the same way, that's another, like wherever they are, to be able to access things or like having them behave in the same way, independent of where they are, is a way to judge whether you're on the right path. Because for me, in my opinion, having one way of doing things like reinforces kind of that muscle memory, that consistent way of accessing and applications in those environments is important.
So to prepare your organization for a successful zero trust program, it's really important to let the users, the people that are actually going to be touched by all the security, know that there may be a little bit of discomfort at the beginning because some things are going to get moved around, some controls are going to be updated. It's possible it could be a little bit bumpy. That's okay, it's part of a process. But also let them know that as we get this right, good security, when it's in place, actually operates pretty similar to magic. You don't know that you're necessarily operating in a secure fashion. Like Google with their BeyondCorp rollout, they have tens of thousands of users all over the world that never actually have to know that they're doing anything security related. Other than maybe every once in a while they plug in a YubiKey or a Titan key and then move on. So to prepare the organization for that, what I tell folks is just be aware that in the beginning, could be a little bit discomfort, maybe some turbulence as we take off, but as we get towards the end state, as we progressed, it will get to where you're not even necessarily aware that you're operating and living in a secure environment.
I agree with that completely. I think the transition can sometimes be hard, right? When you're not following this model and then you're moving into a model. So for our world, is about not being segmented, having a large flat environment where anybody can talk to anybody, to a segment environment. The transition is sometimes difficult, right? And I think, one strategy we talk about is taking an application or a set of applications and successfully testing out the process, like testing out the communication to the people, testing out all the controls and make sure they work. Because the first one is hard, right? Like making sure it works, making sure you've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. Because your point is really valid. Is when you roll this out at scale, you need the automation in place. You need this to happen transparently. You need to have it happen quickly, right? That's where the automation, like if you don't have some of those things in place, if people are slowed down by a zero trust or segmentation rollout, like that will put the brakes on things. So like doing a lighthouse win, like having a win, having a way to show how this can work and how it can work quickly, how it can and be a business enabler. All those things help make these rollouts go at scale.
When you're looking at ZTX, which is our framework for implementing zero trust, there are 7 pillars. There's users or people, devices, workloads, network. Data is at the center of this whole thing because that's what we're all actually doing. Like that's why we're in security, is to protect data. And then it's surrounded by 2 rings of automation, orchestration, and visibility and analytics. So that's actually a pretty big pie to bite off of if you just jumped on the whole thing at once. What I tell folks to start on first is to focus on the people side of the equation, the users. If you look at the history of exploitation, you look at where bad things have started from all the way from 1977, which is some of the research that we're getting ready to publish on the likelihood of exploitation across that space for 40-something years. It starts with people, bad passwords, logins, people getting hacked, social engineering, all that. So if I don't have a really good identity and access management program, I don't have things like mandated 2-factor, single sign-on, just simple security controls, good password management, all that, everything else is moot. So I tell people, focus on that first, make sure that it's as bulletproof as you can get it, and then look at the next couple of pillars that are to the right in that framework. If you have less of one of the other, that's where I think you should focus at next because it's easier to solve. You have less of a device problem, great. Dive in on devices and fix the device issue. You have less of a workload problem because you're not into the cloud yet and you don't have tens of thousands of things running around there, great, go there. But point being, fix this thing, then branch off and fix one of those next ones. And if you look at how the framework's actually built, as you do those pieces to the left, The network pillar, which is over here to the right, you're actually helping to dial in on what you are responsible for in the network. And the last thing I'll say is you see automation, orchestration, and visibility analytics are part of that. So as you're doing this, you should be getting more capability in those other things because of increases to automation, orchestration, and greater visibility and analytics.
And when we talk with people about where to start in terms of segmentation, we talk to people about identifying crown jewels. Like, what are the critical, what are the critical assets? People need to have a list of applications that they have a list of which ones or where the critical data is stored, and you can have this prioritized. Like, that's a good exercise and a way to start, and then people can apply segmentation starting with those critical applications at the bottom and sort of work their way up. That's a good way to start. And I also want to, echo back what you sort of said in terms of the automation. These are, dynamic environments. Like, there are new applications coming, there are things getting deprovisioned, there are new people coming, there are potentially new acquisitions. There's a lot, these organizations have a lot of, they are very dynamic. So you need an adaptive solution, right? Something that, whether it's the processes, the automation, you just sort of said the analytics, you need to constantly sort of adapt to this change. You need to have a process to make that work, or else you can't be successful at any of those unless you have that.
Yeah, the applications is something that comes up a lot of times, in the workload side of this, and our own research indicates that the average user touches 33 applications a day. So, if you can imagine how many users you have in an environment, touching 33 as a baseline number of applications a day, if you can't be adaptive to that sort of changing and growing and bursting and shifting landscape, especially in an ethereal world like where applications live in the virtual space, it's a really hard problem to solve without a solution that actually enables you to do that.
Zero Trust is not a product, but a strategy. It's the application of this classic concept we've been calling least privilege, but universally to your entire organization. Some basic examples. Historically, we've had endpoints behind the perimeter, and we've treated those endpoints differently to those outside the perimeter. Zero Trust philosophy is treating all user endpoints equally from a security point of view, no matter where they are. Another example is traditionally in the data center. All servers could talk to all other servers. That's a massive lateral movement risk. Microsegmenting applications therefore becomes critical as part of your Zero Trust strategy for data center and cloud workloads. Successful deployment and implementation of Zero Trust involves an alignment of technology, people, and process. But a lot of it is about the people and process. There needs to be organizational readiness. And there needs to be a mindset change inside the organization from this unfettered access, which you might have had, to just the minimum access to get your job done. And that needs to be backed by an investment in automation to enable to go fast. Secondly, there needs to be stakeholder buy-in and ownership. Zero Trust is not something a CISO can just do unilaterally. There needs to be buy-in from the businesses. And we've seen some businesses sort of see Zero Trust as a business differentiator. Being a trustworthy custodian of the customer's data is something that's valuable in the market. There's some core capabilities of the Zero Trust, but honestly, if you think about risk, a lot of it lives below the surface. It's that lack of visibility into the truth about what's going on. So the first critical step in enabling Zero Trust is visibility. Visibility helps you build a map of your applications, a map of your application dependencies. And the map is where you start. The map gets people on the same page. It is the ground truth of their application connectivity, and having everybody start with the same foundational understanding is key to success. The map also tells you where you want to go, and it shows you how to measure the progress along that path. Another important thing is identifying and focusing on crown jewels. Right? Your crown jewels are your critical applications that run your business. And it's also the valuable data wherever it exists. Right? And the map helps you identify those crown jewels and have a risk-based view of your assets. Another core capability for Zero Trust is effective segmentation. Segmentation secures crown jewels from that lateral movement attacks. For example, WannaCry spread through organizations because of the lack of segmentation inside those environments. And honestly, the blueprint of most modern breaches is an initial compromise through a low-value asset, and then lateral movement into the high value asset of interest. And we see this time and time again. Also, you really need to be able to support both your brownfield and your greenfield environments. The key to brownfield is having an interactive real-time map, and the key to greenfield is a focus on automation and having a secure by default philosophy. In both situations, being able to scale this inside an organization is pushing policy out to the application owners. It's a critical capability. So how does Illumio help you operationalize your zero trust strategy? Well, it turns out Illumio has pioneered a new approach to zero trust segmentation that is not tied to the underlying infrastructure or network. This idea of decoupling zero trust segmentation from the network kind of makes sense when you take a step back, because networking's goal has always been about connecting things, connecting everything. Meanwhile, zero trust segmentation is really about isolation, keeping things apart. And you can see how these two things are at odds and can introduce risk if not done well. Decoupling also makes sense in a heterogeneous multi-infrastructure or multi-cloud environment, so you can take it anywhere. So it turns out decoupling actually makes things go faster, can be cheaper, and most importantly, minimizes the risk of breaking things. Just to summarize, start with identifying and focus on your crown jewels. Create a zero trust plan and roadmap where goals, metrics, and milestones are aligned with business objectives. And a key part of any zero trust plan is going to be zero trust segmentation that's decoupled from your network and infrastructure. And you need to be agile and focus on automation. Last but not least, remember zero trust is not a destination, but a journey, and we're here to help.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about Illumio and our zero trust solution, please check out our website, where you'll also find ways to try out the solution for yourself.